So very happy to be here this afternoon with Julian Huppert, MP for Cambridge, who was due to give one of our politics and internet lectures last term, but we didn't get you just before Christmas. But we're actually doubly glad you're here now because it's during term time. We really wanted to come and get you to speak at the OII because we've been very encouraged, if you like, by a lot of the sort of the speeches and contributions you've made around internet policy in Parliament. We're concerned perhaps that not as many MPs know enough about this. I mean, in many ways it shouldn't be surprising. Obviously, you've got a background as a scientist, as an academic. But just out of interest, what first interested you in internet issues, internet policy?
I think it's sort of hard to imagine what wasn't the thing that interested me. I mean, I guess I'm partly of a generation where I use the internet. I do lots of things on. I mean, I used to do computational biology, so I wrote Perl scripts and did things like that. So I was sort of involved with some of that culture. And the idea of not knowing about it just feels a bit weird. I guess politically, what got me particularly involved just before I was elected to Parliament was the Digital Economy Act, and seeing how some of that went through. And like many people, I watched the, let's call it a debate in the House of Commons. It was something like 35 minutes. And it was painfully obvious that people did not understand what they were talking about. There was a totemic moment where the minister referred to an IP address as an intellectual property address.
Oh my goodness.
And it's, I have no problem with the idea of people disagreeing with me about things, but I'd like them to know what they're talking about. I think I should try and know what I'm talking about. But it's that level of understanding, and it's quite low. I mean, I won an award for the Internet Service Providers Association for
Internet Hero of the Year, weren't you? I
think.
But
the bit that was the citation was for being the only MP who truly understands the internet. And the problem is, I know how little I understand about the internet. My level of knowledge is really very low, and it's slightly alarming that other people might be even lower.
Let's focus on that as a sort of quick example. And you not only asked the right questions, I think, about the communications data bill, but you also you had a sort of a position, if you like, as to how what the policy should be. I mean, what was it you found? What was the most problematic aspect of it, do you think, at the time?
I think that the most bizarre thing about the communications data bill, which is looking at the sort of the 570,000 requests that we currently have, and trying to have more and keep more information, was how little thought there was about evidence base when trying to develop the policy. So if I was proposing to expand an existing programme, over 500,000 requests a year, I'd like more, I would expect to have information on how it's being used. So when we ask questions like, how many people does that relate to? The answer was, don't know. When we ask questions like, who's making all of these requests? Don't know. What purpose? Is it about terrorism? How many are about drugs offence? How many other things? Don't know. And it's very, very odd because there really wasn't an attitude from the Home Office that they should have this evidence and make a case. And I was really genuinely quite surprised that there wasn't that evidence. I expected it to be a balancing decision, that there's a sort of philosophical value about how you trade off privacy versus security to the extent that it is a trade-off, but there's a value space. This was just simply a sort of, we don't know. How many lives did it save? Don't know. What's it achieve? Don't really know. That was a huge shock to me. But it's also interesting just seeing how the public rhetoric was all about, we need this to stop terrorists, paedophiles. And there was comments from some senior people who should know better that anybody who opposes this is on the side of the paedophiles. Like, no, not in the slightest.
Which forestalled proper, critical debate, and that, I think you're absolutely right. It's one of the sort of real difficulties with, and also the way it was debated at the time. It's obviously been a theme, though, that's continued to be of interest to you, and you're going to talk a bit about sort of privacy in the digital age today. I mean, what's your position on how we deal with the scenario post-Snowden? What should the British government be doing right now?
I think there's a huge amount. And Snowden was an amazing revelation. I mean, even those who've been working very closely on communications data and all of this stuff, even people within government, didn't know about any of this, which is even more alarming that we were being asked to make judgments without knowing any of the facts. I think that there's a really good quote from Sir David Oman, the former head of GCHQ, which he wrote in his Demos report, 2012, Hash Intelligence, where he said that whenever you're going to do something new, it has to rest on public and parliamentary approval and understanding. That has to be the principle. And clearly that's what hasn't happened. I mean, GCHQ do a fantastic, really, really important job. I don't think anybody would deny that. But there hasn't been that engagement. There hasn't been that sense of Parliament, let alone the public, saying, yes, it's okay what you're doing. And part of that is Parliament's fault. I mean, Parliament has failed to debate these things properly, it's failed to consider these things properly, it's passed extremely broad legislation like the 1984 Telecommunications Act, Section 94, which gives essentially carte blanche without any oversight. So I think it's very much our fault for doing this. We set an incredibly broad template, and GCHQ have tried to act within what we said. So I think we now have to have a pause and a detailed review that has to include looking at the legislation, has to include improving oversight, so changing the Intelligence and Security Committee so it's something more effective. I'd like to see something like the US-style Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, so there is more monitoring of what goes on, so that we can actually have a balance and some debate. And one of the big problems has been in this country, that debate has been heavily silenced. It's been about whether the Guardian should be prosecuted rather than what our public policy ought to be.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem strange to me that actually the public aren't more outraged about some of the revelations. And there are some interesting suggestions as to why it's so different, say, from the state of the debate in the US. Do you think, I mean, is privacy just not a very... Is it not a value that the Brits are used to thinking about and talking about, or what?
No, I don't think it's that. I don't think it's that at all. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we do have a sense of privacy. It is changing. Different generations have a different attitude to privacy. We see young people often quite willing to share public information on Twitter and other social media in a way that I would feel uncomfortable with sharing. No, I think it's very simple. The Germans have the memory of the Stasi. Americans have memories of McCarthy and of the FBI going wrong. We have memories of James Bond and Bletchley Park. And, you know, James Bond is a hero. Yeah. And so we have a very different attitude to the intelligence security services.
A last question, I suppose. Obviously, the sort of the critical issue that you've raised that we're all thinking about is how one balances concerns for security and privacy ultimately. I mean, do we really just need to get used, though, to the idea that all electronic communication is obviously inherently vulnerable, really, and you can't put it beyond the reach of the state? I mean, is that just an inevitability, or do you think actually there's going to be pushback against that?
I think there are three categories of groups where there is an issue about privacy infringements. One of them is the state, one of them is private companies where we've consented to give the data over, and the other one is criminal activity. And so whatever laws we make for the state, there is still the problem that electronic communications can be broken by other people. Yeah. So we shouldn't just assume that the only problem is the state. So I would certainly assume that anything really sensitive, if you put it in an email, there is a risk of it going astray, whether it's to the state, whether it's a criminal activity. So if you're really concerned, just don't put things electronically. And most people who are quite good at careful about their information security would follow that. I think we will have to work out what the balance is, because there is clearly benefit to the state of having access to some of this information. I think we need to set clear principles about how that works, about proportionality, about it being a last resort, for example, which even David Owen has argued for. And I'd like to see much more that's driven by suspicion. So rather than scanning everything, which is very suspicion-less, let's focus on where we start off with some suspicion. That strikes me as a much more effective way of doing it, because the other issue is how much benefit is there from all of this? Yeah. How much money and effort goes into it? And how does that compare to other things that we could have done? Yeah. To look at the Communications Data Bill example, that was predicted to cost £1.8 billion over 10 years. And I actually directly asked the Commissioner of the Met Police, how would you spend £1.8 billion to improve safety? And he said, I'd hire more police officers, I'd do more training, and I'd have better technology. Yeah. Are we spending the money the best way? Yeah. It's very hard to know that. Yeah.
That's an excellent question. I hope you keep asking that question. Well, I think that's really important.
I hope to.
Julian, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.